Dzvinka Kachur is researcher at the Center for Sustainability Transitions at the University of Stellenbosch, and she's also honorary president of the Ukrainian Association of South Africa. And it's about the shared history of our two countries that we're going to be speaking today. Welcome, Dzvinka.
Thanks a lot for inviting me.
So Dzvinka, please tell us a bit more about yourself and how that brought you to South Africa.
Thanks. So I think I need to make a disclaimer, and I'm not a historian, so I'm an amateur. I've been in South Africa since 2011 and worked here in the supporting civil society organizations, community organizations, and at the Stellenbosch University. Naturally, I'm also involved as part of Ukrainian community and co-founded the Ukrainian Association of South Africa.
But your association has also done work on the history of the community, and that's part of the reason why we've asked you to speak. And there's a long-standing migration of Eastern Europeans to the Cape from as long ago, apparently, as 1497. But the first Ukrainian geographical name on the South African map is the Hetman Ivan Mazeppa, who lived from 1639 to 1709. Before discussing his African impact, can you tell us a bit more about him as a figure in Ukrainian history?
Absolutely, because he's a very interesting person. He's on our 10 Hryvnia Ukrainian money note. So he's obviously extremely influential and important for our history. Ivan Mazeppa was part of Ukrainian military Cossack aristocracy. So his father was educated. He was extremely well educated first in Kyiv, in Ukraine. He went to college, and then he was sent to a few European countries. He studied in Italy, in Germany, in Warsaw. He spoke 8 languages fluently, including Latin, Italian, Turkish, because he had to do some diplomacy work. And he's also a person that had a very strong vision for how Ukraine should develop. Also, he was writing poems, he was playing different musical instruments. So this is really that kind of aristocratic Ukrainian Cossacks generation, and he came in a very interesting time. So he was a leader that united left and right bank of Ukraine and saw that Ukraine can be a strong country if we have strong economy and well-educated population. So I think it's quite progressive at the times that he spent so much funding on developing schools, printing books, funding churches, because he saw that the church would be the basis for that education. At the time, monasteries were centers for science development, for education, and at that time, Ukrainian universities or schools accepted both men and women, so this education was not gender divisive. I think something that might be interesting for researchers on the continent, Mazeppa also funded translation of Gospels into the Arab language. So this was a translation of Gospels into Arab language of Orthodox, Christian Orthodox Church, funded with his money. And a few years ago, I think the copy was found in the archives in Libya, where the front page still has his name, funded by Ivan Mazeppa. So unfortunately for him, at the time, Russian Empire was growing and didn't see Ukraine as being the strong independent autonomy. And that's how the conflict started to develop. Ukraine, Russia started to clash more and more, and then Mazeppa decided he's gonna stand his ground with the military support when Russia wanted to divide Ukraine again into 2 parts, give part to Poland and the left bank to control stronger by Russia. Mazeppa united with the Sweden King Karl XII and unfortunately lost the battle. So why it's such a critical time for Ukrainian history? Because from that time, what he was doing is seen as a risk for Russian Empire. So he was supporting schools, languages. This became the enemy. So obviously, when Mazeppa lost the battle, Russian Tsar demolished and burned to the ground his capital, Baturin, the city, killing all the children, women, everybody. So it was a very strong emotional response to that desire of Ukraine to be independent. And then following few years after that military defeat, we see the first decree by the Tsar to prohibit Ukrainian church books, but then it went further to prohibiting Ukrainian school, prohibiting even music sheets. So any Ukrainian culture was under ban during the 18th and then 19th century. So we see how what he was trying to do became the enemy of Russian Empire. And I also want to mention that his successor, Philip Orlik, wrote the first Ukrainian constitution, which is based on that thinking of Ivan Mazeppa, and saw the vision of, and we are talking beginning of 18th century, the vision of legal system, of executive powers, and also providing rights and obligations for citizens. So I think it was a progressive thinking that definitely impacted everything. It impacted Ukrainian architecture. If anybody today from our listeners would walk on the streets of Kyiv, you could see Ukrainian Baroque style. And this is a specific style in architecture that developed because he was funding so many churches, so many buildings, universities in Ukraine at the time. So you can still see his legacy now.
And then you see the legacy even making its way to South Africa, because on South Africa's wild coast, there is Mazeppa Bay, which had been named after him. Could you please tell us how and, when and why did this naming occur?
Yes, I think it's an interesting story because obviously Mazeppa or any Ukrainian has never tried to colonize Africa and never been to South Africans' shore for that intention. But the name of Mazeppa, his image from that time became quite influential during the period of Romanticism. And I think there are a number of reasons for that. The strong factor is a poem by Byron, which historians did not find any proofs for that story to be true, but that during his time when he was serving in the Polish kingdom, that he had a love affair with one of the people there, and he was punished, was put naked on a horse and sent through the wild steppes. And the horse dies during this adventure, but Mazeppa transforms into the leader of the country that is taking on a very strong role to lead his nations, his community to freedom. So this Byron's poem and the fascination that for a leader, for the artist to emerge, you need to go through certain sufferings. Human sufferings lead you to the greatness, felt into this category for Mazeppa. Also, this is a time when Western Europe rediscovers Eastern Europe. So this was something new, something different and exotic. And that's also one of the factors why Mazeppa story became so prominent. This is for South African Mazeppa Bay, the influence of Byron's poem, and Byron himself named his ship, his yacht, Mazeppa. It became sort of a fashion to name a boat Mazeppa because it was symbolized with freedom, with speed. So at the time when Mazeppa schooner was built, it was originally built in 1842 in America. There were many other similar boats in the Atlantic seas, in other seas, named Mazeppa. Shuni Mazeppa was traveling along South African coast, doing trade all the way to Mozambique, and often stayed in one of the bays, so that bay received the name Mazeppa Bay.
Tony Forsis from the University of KwaZulu-Natal has spoken about the ways various South African writers and artists have taken inspiration from Mazeppa's life. Can you give us some examples of this cultural cross-fertilization?
Yes, I think first of all, a massive thank you to Tony Vos, who dedicated 5 academic articles to the topic of Mazeppa. So pretty much everything that we know about the Shuna Mazeppa, the Mazeppa in the South African literature, maybe in literature generally, it's coming from Tony Vos's research. And I must be honest, I also learned about Mazeppa Bay as a geographical location through his academic work. So I first read his article and I could not believe that indeed in South Africa there could be a geographical location that has Mazeppa's name, and how that would be possible. Obviously, by growing up in the Soviet Union, we had a very different understanding of Mazeppa. Majority of his storyline was completely different. The Russian Orthodox Church still sings anathema to Mazeppa for trying to for Ukraine to be independent. So to suddenly learn that he was such a massive impact in the period of Romanticism was also new for me personally. But yes, so Byron, Hugo, Slovatsky, Tchaikovsky, Liszt all wrote in Europe. And then at the beginning of 20th century, Roy Campbell, as well as a few other South African poets wrote, like Thomas Pringle, William Gibbon, William Scully, wrote on the narrative of Mazeppa. This was a reworked story because obviously each context provide their own understanding, and I think here the man, the horse, and the local exotic people, as it was seen by those artists at the time, were probably rethinking the colonial project that was ongoing during that time, and saw again personal suffering and being misunderstood by the time, the society, as a strong narrative that would speak to them in the Mazeppa story.
But taking on from that, if you think in terms of colonialism, war, injustice, in South Africa, of course, the South African War is one of the turning points in our history. And there has been quite a historiography arising around Russian participation. And yet there were also Ukrainians among the volunteers who served on both sides of the war. But that distinction has not quite been made as acutely as one realizes it needs to be made. Could you tell us a bit more? What is known about Ukrainian participation in the South African War, and what are the limitations that have prevented research or further research on this particular topic?
Yes, I think the whole connection between Ukraine and South Africa lacks that research, and I hope that your podcast will also spur the interest, so that there will be more people who would want to look into those connections and discover them. There is a number of limitations, while one of the major for Ukrainian side is the lack of archives. Because if you think about the history of the territory, and those who want to know more can read the Bloodlands by Timothy Snyder, where he goes deeper into what was actually happening during 20th century on the territory of Ukraine. But we have World War I, where the territory is actually happening at the territory of Ukraine. It's a front line between Austrian Empire and the Russian Empire. So you have cities burned to the ground. You have destructions. You have people also evacuation of archives, never returning them back, moving them to different places. And you have a short period of Ukrainian independence in 1917, 1920, where again the archives were reformed. But as soon as Ukraine loses its independence, the fight against archives, the fight against those documents starts again to destroy them so that they do not exist. And then Second World War, again, the first, the Molotov-Ribbentrop agreement was signed. The Russian forces came forward through the territory of Ukraine. The Germans came backwards, and then Soviets came forward again. So it means that so many archives have been completely destroyed. And then follows a story of persecutions, where family would voluntarily destroy any documents or any photographs, not to be persecuted for anything that they would that the state might see as not would make them not reliable citizens of the new Soviet country. So I think the lack of archives that remaining is our biggest challenges, and also the scattering of remaining archives into different parts of the world. So I think this is also something that South Africa slightly, maybe in a different way, but also shares with Ukraine, that our archives could turn up in a completely different place that we could even imagine, and that work needs to be done for us to collect the grains of documents, so that then afterwards we can rethink our history. And that's a very difficult job, to find those seeds, those little documents that can tell us the true story, because so many narratives were painted over that you first need to take that scrape that paint away, find those grains, and then you can see the real picture. But going back, I think there is one story that might entertain the listeners, and this is of a Ukrainian writer, poet. He was writing a lot of literature books, Yuri Pokos. His name was Yuri Budyak, and that he was using, but his real surname was Pokos. He was fighting in South Africa on the Boer side, and according to the legend, he was the one who detained Winston Churchill during the World War II, and because he saw Churchill was a book writing, he had a strong emotional connection to him, being a writer himself. So he said, "No, I'm not going to kill you. You can leave." Then the side changed, and I think. And then the Boers lost Churchill. Churchill was free, but their connection, according to the legend, stayed, and they, while in secrecy, but communicated and stayed in touch. Unfortunately, during the Second World War, Yuri Pokos, after being in the concentration camp, died from hunger. But yes, I think there are probably more of those stories that can tell us about different connections of our country.
I want to speak about, or ask you to speak to us about some of those connections, and I want to have a sweeping question, which is Ukraine as part of the Russian world in the late 19th century. There's pogroms, we all understand, in 1890. Which lead to a Jewish diaspora, and we often speak about Russians who migrate from, the Pale of Settlement, and they populate South Africa. Can you speak to us about that diaspora, including also perhaps the Russian Revolution and its impact, and what is the Ukrainian dimension of that, and maybe speak about prominent people who might sometimes be classified as being Russian but diaspora, but they're actually Ukrainian, like Xenia Belmas and Boris Belinsky. Just a sense of that first diaspora 1890 onwards and what is Ukrainian within it.
Yes, so I think we often think about African people in Europe as refugees, but we not often think that Eastern Europeans in Africa are refugees. So majority of those people who would come from the territory of Ukraine to South Africa were people who were displaced because of political changes that were happening on the ground. So all those names that you've mentioned, they probably would happily live in Ukraine if their livelihood, their homes were not destroyed. So when we talk about the Jewish migration, if you remember from the Mazeppa times, Ukraine had certain autonomy. Then as in Russian Empire is growing, the legislation also moves to the territory of Ukraine, and it was during the end of 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, that line of settlement, which was not implemented in the central Ukraine, has moved by Russian Tsar, which meant practically that those multicultural communities that were in Kyiv, in Chernihiv, in Odessa, in Ukrainian cities, where people from of Polish origin, Armenian origins, Jewish origins would live, German origins would live side by side to each other, were now forced to be broken. So Jewish community were not allowed to live in cities. So practically it meant that those communities were pushed by the Russian Empire from cities. Their lifestyles could not continue and they had to migrate. So some of the records that we've seen suggest that about 15,000 of Jewish people only from Kyiv have moved to different parts of the world. And in South Africa, at that time, it's an exciting time of discovering the gold. So it looked like maybe this could be a new beginning. So people would move. If you talk about Xenia Belmas, she was also Ukrainian aristocracy. Her family, as the Soviet Union implements nationalization, it means that all land is confiscated. People who were landowners are not allowed to live on their lands. They are forced to migrate. So she migrates first to the Western Europe, where she sings opera. She's a singer. Unfortunately, she didn't feel safe because her husband was a Jewish person from Kyiv. So they move further and make this decision maybe to stay just before the World War II in South Africa, which looks safer at the time. When we talk about Boris Belinsky, this is even more difficult story because you can see the history of Ukraine coming very strongly in his lifestyle. He was born in 1905 in Kyiv, again to well-educated family. His dad was a teacher of law, and he was fascinated with the British legal system. So during lunches in their family, the dad tried to speak English, while his grandfather is an Orthodox priest who also provides him with this cultural learning. He is enjoying singing, he's enjoying music, he's playing music instrument from a young age, learns many languages, and also becomes a scientist like his mom, who was teaching biology at the Ukrainian university. So at the age of 25, he becomes a full professor. This in a new field of embryology, so just developing. Kyiv University is one of the leading institutions at that time under Ivan Schmalzhausen. Belinsky is marrying the love of his life at a time, who's also a scientist at the same university. So everything looks very positive, very happy, until it turns out that the science genetics is not allowed in the Soviet Union, and also that those who support Ukrainian narratives, generally, to be honest, it feels like anyone who is anyone at the time is at risk of being prosecuted. So his wife is arrested, spends 3 years in a labor camp. The unit where he was researching is destroyed. People simply disappear on the streets because it's a Stalin very difficult time, 1937, where pretty much everybody gets persecuted and nobody feels safe. So for Belinsky, whose family was quite supportive of Ukrainian independence, how we know from his autobiography, and I'm going to read this so that because it speaks to our question on the archives and what's left. So he writes in his autobiography that when Ukraine declared independence in 1917, he was still a child. So he wrote in his diary that parents cheered with champagne for Ukrainian independence. Now the independence is down, the Soviet forces are in Kyiv, and his mom scratches in his kids' diaries that sentence so that nobody can persecute them. And that's something that struck him, that, you have to modify even children's diary so that nobody knows the truth. So I think we are lucky that Boris Belinsky managed to fly from the territory of Ukraine, because majority of his French scientists unfortunately were killed, but he came to South Africa and became a leading scientist here. He writes his first textbook on embryology that is translated into 7 languages, becomes a must read for any person in the field. And in his book, he mentions how many those experiments that came from Kyiv were in that textbook. So I think it tells us the difficult, storyline, how people were trying to survive and do what they deeply loved, do science, but even doing that might have not been possible if you lived in a specific region, like at the time, the territory of Ukraine. So I think for those Ukrainians who managed to come to South Africa, they wanted to continue the life that they could.
That's very gripping if you think of, the story of essentially refugees seeking refuge elsewhere where they, can use their talents. And then, you find the other side of the coin in the 1960s up to the 1990s, when it's from the South African side, the ANC, African National Congress, that is taken up arms against the apartheid government and engaged in the liberation struggle. And in this regard, Ukraine is also part of the story. So could you tell us how Ukraine aided the ANC's liberation struggle during these years?
Yes, I think that's also a part of the history that we need to rethink how it all fits together. But yes, as Ukraine, Soviet Socialist Republic, Ukraine was one of the co-founders of the UN system with South Africa at the time. And so it was in the UN, the Soviet bloc was represented by the Soviet Union, which was Russia, but also independently by Ukraine and Belarus. So this is an interesting system, because Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union, one of the 15 republics, but yet it was a special, had a special vote in the in the UN system. And many people in Ukraine, in the diplomatic spheres, obviously recognize that Ukraine almost had no independent foreign policy. But if we read the book by Hennady Udovenko, Ukrainian diplomat who served as a Ukrainian Soviet representative, and afterwards, after Ukrainian independence, as the first Ukrainian Minister of Foreign Affairs, he says that supporting anti-apartheid movement was that area where Ukrainian diplomats felt their freedom. So Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic was part of the Anti-Apartheid Committee in UN. So the Soviet Union was not part of that committee. It was a Ukrainian role to fulfill that position, and the representative of Ukraine would be the deputy chair of that UN committee for decades. So this was the area where Ukrainian diplomats could start the resolutions, could shape the thinking, how to implement sanctions, or how to pressurize South African government into negotiating the settlement and stop persecution of the population. Apart from that, since 1963, we have documents suggesting that Ukrainian cities like Odessa and Sevastopol, Simferopol were accepting UNCON-WSIZW and ANC fighters for military trainings. And further on, many South Africans would study, receive a degree from Ukrainian universities. Sindisom Fenyana, I think one of those prominent people who we often talk, because he wrote his own book, Walking with Giants, where he calls Kiev as his second home. So we do know those stories, and I think, again, it would be nice to research it deeper. We have found a copy of a letter that or Tambo sent to Ukrainian government to thank for supporting in UN sanctions against, or like supporting voting in UN against South African apartheid. So I think we have quite a lot of those documents, but further work needs to happen. And one of them is to identify how many actually people were studying in Ukraine. There is no unified archive. We've looked into it. So the records are at the level of university. So we are lobbying for more research onto the topic of who studied what degree, and also what were their life stories, because it's interesting to see those connections and how they shaped and the understanding of people's lives. So students' time is one of the most critical for our development of formation as individual. And already, if anyone reads the stories on the South African History Online webpage, which has lots of resources, you can see that many people were questioning the Soviet Union system and the oppression of including Ukrainian nationals. You can see those evidence and the treatment of women in the system, etc. So I think it's a work that, once again, cannot be done quickly and politically. It has to be done by historians who, once again, find those little seeds and can build that understanding without manipulations, or with as little manipulations as possible.
Sure. I mean, one of the seeds, I don't know whether I've got the pronunciation correct, is Przed, and it's on the Black Sea coast. It's where the Soviet Union had major training for its military, and the first UNCON-WSIZW cadres it's basically the Lutuli detachment. People who know about the ANC in exile will know about the Lutuli detachment, but that's where they got their large-scale training. So they all speak about, and the instructors would have been Ukrainian as well. So right from 1963, 64, they're involved in training up the first guerrilla war contingents. You've spoken about the disillusionment that some are, criticism some are beginning to develop towards the Soviet Union, and we've got the collapse from 89 to 91, and then we've got diaspora, a new wave of diaspora. Can you tell us a bit about that generation of Ukrainians in South Africa?
Yes, so before 1992, Ukraine and South Africa didn't have any diplomatic relationships. So predominantly those Ukrainians who were here were hiding or did not want to be in touch with Soviet Union. And we can see how, for example, in the story of Boris Balinsky, 1991, Ukraine gets independent and he's immediately on the flight going to Kyiv to see Ukraine. And he went to his university, and on his second visit also brought a collection of butterfly as a present for Ukrainian University, and that collection is still there, and students can learn about also South African, Southern African butterflies based on his research. So that connection to Ukraine was there, but 1991 is a very difficult economically time for Ukraine, for post-Soviet countries, where suddenly, again, your life collapses and people trying to survive. So those who were more entrepreneurial also look for opportunities around the world, and some of them come to South Africa. There was a program in South Africa that was recruiting doctors, and the Soviet diplomas would be recognized in South Africa without any additional exams. This also partially because so many doctors were trained in Ukraine, so they would have those Soviet diplomas. So it allows Ukrainian doctors to come and work in the South African public hospitals, and we have about 10% of our community are specifically those doctors who could not earn living in Ukraine due to collapse of the Soviet Union. Suddenly you either not receiving salary for 6 months, 12 months, or you receive it in such a little amount that is not enough even to put bread on the table. So people are looking for those economical opportunities and come to South Africa, or those who want to try and run maybe their business to do something that they can provide to their family. So that's, I think, the first migration that was starting at the after the collapse of the Soviet Union. We have sadly another line where Ukrainian migrated more. That's in 2014 when Russia invaded Crimea. So then from 2014 we have unfortunately another wave. That's when Russia invades Crimea and eastern Ukraine. So about 1.5 million of Ukrainians lose their houses. So they have to look for another place where to go to. Some of them resettle in Ukraine, but we also have some of those people who would come to South Africa. But a majority of Ukrainian community in South Africa, probably up to 80% are mixed marriages. These are people from different walks of life who somehow meet each other and settle in Ukraine or in South Africa. So I think it's not common for Ukrainian to meet South African on the street. And that's how we also learn about different connections between our countries that might not be so visible through those stories, how people meet each other.
And then in 2017, you established the Ukrainian Association of South Africa. So could you tell us a bit more about it? What came before it, and why was the decision taken to form it in 2017, and what does it look like today?
Yes, of course. So the decision came, it was formally registered as NGO and voluntary association in 2017. But I think that the increase of social activism in Ukrainian diaspora communities around the world came in 2014, 2013 even, as Ukraine once again was fighting on the streets for their independence in choosing foreign policy, because Ukraine went through a few of those revolutions. Obviously, 1990, 1990, 1991, the revolution on granite, as it's called, when Ukrainian students went on a hunger strike to fight for Ukrainian independence. In 2004, it's an orange revolution to have our independent democratic elections without falsifications, so that our decision, our vote can be counted. So in 2013, when the Ukrainian president decided to sign the agreement, which was against the legislation of Ukraine, students initially came to the streets. They were very badly beaten, and that's what created a strong response from society, because in Ukrainian society, similar to South African societies, children is something that you do not touch. So when the state and police beaten students in a very harsh way, it created a very strong response. So following the revolution of dignity and Russian invasion of Ukraine, military invasion of Ukraine, which started in February 2014, Putin decided to take over militarily Crimea and then to invade the eastern part of Ukraine. It definitely evokes Ukrainian identity. And I can tell the story. One of people from Ukrainians from Crimea who moved to South Africa in 1992. He came to that meeting that we had in 2014, and he said, obviously with the sarcasm and the humor, that we need to thank to Putin for reminding us that we are Ukrainians, because here maybe we forgot it a little bit. So obviously after Ukrainian independence, Ukraine wanted to be a peaceful country. We gave up nuclear weapon. We thought, we don't need that fight for our identity. We are just people of the world, and Russian invasion definitely reminded us that we need to fight for our right to remain who we are, like Mazeppa fought, or like many other of our ancestors had to fight, were forced to fight. So already in 2014, Ukrainian community staged its first protest in front of Russian consulates and embassies, and in 2015 was registered the first form of Ukrainian association with the idea that it would allow us to support humanitarian projects, because obviously the war means that there are lots of refugees, there are lots of needs that can be also supported from abroad. But that initial form didn't have a membership, so it did not include the large amounts of Ukrainians who were living in South Africa. So that's why the new form that was registered in 2017 was including the membership and is registered as a South African non-profit organization.
And then there's another Russian invasion in February 2022. And how has the escalation of the conflict affected the Ukrainian community in South Africa?
I think it affected every single Ukrainian and unfortunately South African around the world, because those instabilities that the Russian invasion triggered at the global level, whether it's financial instability or energy system instability, food systems instabilities, it affected everybody. And we can see that also in the form of militarization. So it's not that impact has not stopped. now, 3 years down the line, it's unfortunately going to affect all of us more and more. And it's not just because 20% of Ukrainian territory is under occupation and the human rights violation. We are now over 200,000 documented cases, and people's lives are destroyed. But because it sent a very strong message for countries around the world that we need to invest in military defense. So what we've already projected, but now we can confidently say it in numbers, that there was more than 7% of military expenses increase in 2023 globally. And now the further dramatic increase of 9% comparing to 2023 in 2024. So the trend that Russia has started, where we are working not towards sustainable development, health issues, education issues, but on the right to defend ourselves and internationally, unfortunately, I think is a negative trend that impacts all of us, and it impacted the Ukrainian community as well. In 2017, Ukrainian Association saw its responsibility to build cultural connections between Ukraine and South Africa. We thought there is so many things that we have in common, maybe not straightforward like neighboring countries, but on a different level. We became independent in 1990s. We have to rethink our identity. We have to rebuild our institutions that were serving only a certain part of the population so that they include our beliefs about ourselves, this line towards democratization, a strong connection to the values of democracy, of freedom. And we thought that through cultural and supporting those cultural cooperation between Ukraine and South Africa, it would help us to see each other and see ourselves in each other. Since 2022, our annual activities such as the Ukrainian Festival and support for those cultural projects was pretty much diminished because our efforts were much more towards sharing the understanding of what is happening in Ukraine and explaining the situation in Ukraine to South African government. And later on, building solidarity movement with South African civil society, because as researching the state capture at Stellenbosch University, it gave me a very clear understanding on how South African society works, so that civil society plays a crucial role in keeping government accountable, and the role that independent media plays in providing the understanding of the situation. So as a Ukrainian association, we also used those channels to maybe promote South African foreign policy that is based on South African constitution, human rights, and ideals of democracy. So, and of course, on the personal levels, it affected every single person, because if your family is under bombs daily, it affects how you feel, what you do, how you understand the world, what are your priorities. So I think every single person was and is affected.
I will say also, when shortly after this invasion, the original comedy series by Volodymyr Zelensky, I think it was translated into English as Servant of the People, became accessible. I binge watched it at the time. And what came to mind, because that was precisely at the time of our Snyder Commission and investigations into state capture, were two very recognizable themes. State capture, corruption, it seemed as if we work from the same playbook, but then also this attempt at establishing a separate identity. I could see that also being portrayed in the series, this struggle to assert Ukrainian identity as opposed to a Russian identity. And going back to our earlier question on the Ukraine's involvement with the ANC during the liberation struggle, what has been the experience of this very ambivalent stance by the South African government, since one would say the liberation struggle has roots in both Russia and in Ukraine. At the time, there was a lot of criticism of our government, and now their position is, well, because we had maintained the ambiguous stance, now we have a voice. I'm not sure what the Ukrainian community's response is to that.
I think one maybe a message which is in line with this podcast. I think what 2014 did for Ukraine, it sent us back to our history. In 2015, Ukraine made the bold decision to open all archives, all KGB archives, to everyone. So it provided us with a lot of information that was accessible, because as we come out of the Soviet Union, or South Africa comes out of the apartheid times, we come with those narratives that we not necessarily questioned. And there is this important process that needs to happen in a society where young people go back to archives and learn for themselves what is the truth and what was the narrative, and who were those who are sharing the narratives, and how my personal experience, my family experience fit into all those narratives or situations. So I think it's easy to manipulate our history if we don't know those facts and if we don't know our family stories. It's much more difficult if we do know. So in this case, we understand that, from 1990 to 2022, it's 30 years. So it's a long time, and it's a long time when Ukraine maybe not been as present as it could have been. Obviously, I don't think it was possible, but in the ideal utopian scenario, Ukraine could have been a much more stronger present and maybe maintained the relationship that came out of that time better. So it was easier to manipulate, to say that Ukrainians do not exist, or to say, for example, in the Freedom Park, just overnight, the plate that said Soviet Union was changed to Russia. So all people who were 15 countries who were part of the Soviet Union were suddenly repainted as Russia. And nobody questioned that, because we were not looking or watching in 2022 at that time. And maybe that understanding that Soviet Union was a union of 15 countries was not there. So I think when Russia that was preparing this invasion for many years, because if Ukraine was not preparing, was not working towards that, Russia was working. The invasion of Ukraine in 2014 forced Russia to be more present on the continent, because suddenly the Western sanctions were implemented. Russia needed new markets, new connections, and they started to build those relationships, build narratives, build disinformation, also capacity to run those information manipulations campaign on the continent. And also simply the corrupt models that might have also affected many African countries and might even affect South Africa. Yes, because if you look at how the Russian model is, you have a very small percentage of people who are managing the natural resources and getting enormous benefits, while the majority of population remains in poverty and has to remain in poverty so that it can be controlled. So this model might not be very attractive for many people, but it might be extremely attractive for some of the leaders, because you live a nice lifestyle, you can drive a nice yacht, you can build yourself a nice house, and nobody questions where those money come from. And that's what Russia wants to promote on the continent. So I think obviously those connections existed also in South Africa, and might have influenced how South Africa responded initially to the Russian invasion. Also lack of information, lack of understanding that Russia is trying to rebuild the empire and colonize Ukraine. So I think luckily South Africa is a democracy, which means that the political process is constantly shaped by the perception of people and the values that are written in the constitution. So we can see that currently maybe South Africa has changed slightly, or its position. You can say that South Africa was non-aligned and remains non-aligned. But I think that there are significant changes in how South African position is today. Some of the issues that President has raised, for example, around returning of Ukrainian forcefully deported children, because there are more than 20,000 of documented cases where children were taken from the territory of Ukraine to Russia, and Russia refuses to return them. Already in 2023, Ramaphosa asked Putin to return those children. Putin refuses, because obviously in the colonial understanding, you need to take those children and raise them into soldiers, because this is just the beginning of war, beginning of the time when Russia is conquering the empire. So those soldiers need to be built to go further and to control the land, so they cannot be given back to Ukraine, because Ukrainian identity is not recognized in Putin's understanding. And if anybody wants to know more about that Putin thinking on the topic, you can read the 2021 July article that is signed with the name of Putin, where he clearly explains that in his worldview, Ukrainians do not exist, Ukrainian identity doesn't exist, and that's partially why this war is happening.
The last question I would like to ask, it's based on the present and the future of the Ukrainian community in South Africa, but just thinking about the question, so much of it is contingent on the outcome of the war. And I would like to therefore reframe the question, if you can just sum up for us, what is at stake for Ukrainians everywhere with regards to the outcome of this war? Why does it matter so much, and why would defeat be such an unacceptable option for Ukrainians? What does the future look like in the case of defeat?
I'll reframe it. I'll say that in the case of victory, Ukrainians would be able to remain Ukrainians, because what we can see at the occupied territories happening, the first enemy is Ukrainian books and Ukrainian identity, right? So first, children are not allowed to speak their language at the occupied territories. The freedom of religion is not allowed, whether you are Ukrainian Muslim or Ukrainian Orthodox. Your religion leaders will be persecuted, because you cannot be either Ukrainian Muslim or Ukrainian Jewish or Ukrainian Orthodox. All of those are the enemy of Russian state. And I think it's important to say that you also cannot be different. If you want to be the representative of LGBTQ plus category, then you cannot be in Russia, but you can be in Ukraine. So for Ukrainian diaspora communities, it means that our country, our home would not be safe for us and our children to visit, because first, you cannot speak the language, you cannot say that you are supporting your country, you cannot be who you are. on those multiple levels, whether it's religious, whether it's identity, because this is simply not recognized. And I think we have many stories explaining what's happening at the occupied territory. You simply have no rights. If you go to visit the graves of your parents at the occupied territory, you can disappear and spend the rest of your life being tortured in multiple ways in Russian prisons, and international human rights observers will never find you because they have no right to access political prisoners or prisoners of war at the Russian territory. Your children can be separated from you when you just go to visit your country, because maybe on your social media you've posted something that tells that you are supporting your country or that you are supporting your language, which in the Russian worldview does not exist. So it's a very deep and profound impact. It's not just living without a country, or it means that you simply cannot exist. And I think it's a very strong reason why Ukrainians are continuing to fight. We have more than 60,000 of women that now join the army, and their motivation is very clear. We want simply our children to be able to grow and to live. And the Russian understanding, this would not be possible, because they would have to be joining the army at a young age. They would have to be militarized, grown up with hatred towards anything Ukrainian. And this is something that we don't want. We want to live in a country where anybody can speak the language that they want to, and they can believe into any religion that they want to without being persecuted. And it might sound like a difficult choice, but I think many Ukrainians are dying today so that even Ukrainian Russian-speaking people can speak Russian if they want in their family.
It is heart-wrenching, to say the least, and also recalls so many historical parallels. That's where there's something of a shared humanity in history. My final question would be if people around South Africa want to find out more about the work that you do and the Ukrainian Association and how we can support its activities, please do tell.
Yeah, so I think the easiest way is to go via internet. There is a webpage, www.u8za.co.za. We also have social media, Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, I think even TikTok. So any of those are a source of information. We also have branches in Durban, KZN, in Gauteng, Pretoria, Johannesburg, also in Quebec and Cape Town. So you can look for events in one of those provinces. There are some physical presence. Obviously, you can visit Mazeppa Bay, but we have two Ukrainian bookshelves at the Cape Town Central Library, and now at the university in Pretoria, where if you want to find maybe those books that are rarer to find in South Africa, you can also visit those. Even now with modern technologies, with Kindle, you can buy any book also online, but I would really encourage people to read books written by Ukrainian authors about Ukraine, and not by foreigners, because I think it's important that our history is told by us and not by somebody else. So while Ukraine is going through its own process of deconstruction, decolonization of our history, I think it's also a lot comes into fiction and literature. So if you are not if you are not into history, which I doubt you are if you are listening to this podcast, you can also look into Ukrainian fiction books and look for those different storylines and also challenges that Ukrainians are facing currently in those stories. Ukrainian Association is supporting Ukrainian children's psychological rehabilitation. So if you want to contribute to that, we accept donations. We are working with NGO Voices of Children that was established already in 2014 to support children at the occupied territories and those who were facing the war. They now have large presence, more than 60 psychologists that work 24/7 and also work with those children who were deported or came back from the occupied territories. We've already supported 3 different support rooms. So it's rooms inside some of the orphanages where maybe children are staying without their parents for their emotional and psychological support. One of them is in a school where people with special abilities are staying. So I just want also to use this opportunity to thank to all South Africans who have already contributed to all that work. Thank you very much. I think also since 2022, the response among South Africans was massive, and the Ukrainian Association was partnering with Gift of the Givers and provided that initial humanitarian support in the form of soup kitchens and the basic supplies for millions of people who were displaced initially. So I think the hearts of South Africans really opened for Ukrainians at that time, and I'm really grateful for that as well.
Okay, and that's very much such a worthy initiative to support. Final question, because I agree, we connect through stories. Could you please tell us who are your, let's say, 3 favorite Ukrainian authors? Doesn't have to be history or fiction, whichever, and which books you would recommend that we go get hold of straight away?
Good question.
So one of my favorite writers is Oksana Zabushko. She is quite well translated to English. And I think the book that I would recommend, I'm just struggling maybe exact English translation, but Museum of Secret Hearts, probably Museum of Secrets, Oksana Zabushko. It's a very big book. So it's over 600 pages, but don't get scared of that. It's easy to read, and it connects a lot of historical research of over 10 years. The book is fiction, but it's built on the true stories and over 10 years of documenting the stories during the Second World War, and it specifically connects Ukraine post-2014 and World War II in the Museum of Lost Hearts. I think it should be in English. I think the second one is a very well-known historian, Serhiy Plokhy, and he wrote many books. One connects Ukraine and South Africa also in maybe in a different way. It's about it's called The Poisoned Gun. And it talks about the story of Bogdan Stashinsky, a Ukrainian who killed Stepan Bandera, and then according to some of the documents, because there was no no connection between South Africa and the Soviet Union. He lived the rest of his life in South Africa. But it also opens up the information manipulation campaigns that were already so developed in the 50s that only got better and better with the time. But I think any book by Sergei Plokhy, it's a stamp of quality and many years of research. And then as a third author, I would say Ukrainian poet Serhiy Zhadan. His work is also easy to access. He's from Kharkiv, and I think his poetry extremely popular in Ukraine because he himself is a very charismatic leader and a performer, part of the rock band. So something that Ukrainians cherish maybe in his literature, how connected he remains to everything that happens on the ground. He also supports people on the front line a lot. So maybe read some of his literature as well. But there is also, many others. I think the only author that was published in South Africa was Andrei Kurkov. And some of his work, unfortunately, since 2022, he confessed that he cannot write fiction anymore. He only can write documentaries. So he says, like, suddenly I lost my ability to write fiction. But if you read some of his work since 2014, like Grey Bees, for example, which was turned into the movie, about the struggle of being connected to the land and maybe being, apolitical, and how the politics of everyday life comes to you and forces you onto extremely difficult choices of where I feel at home and what is at home if my home is taken away and everything is changed. So I think we have lots of authors. As Ukrainian Association, we're also promoting Lesa Ukrainka. This is a Ukrainian feminist writer from 19th century, and her work that was turned into a children's performance in South Africa, and it's going to be at the Grahamstown Festival this year. So if your listeners listen in time, please don't miss that opportunity. It talks about nature and society relationship and how to find that balance. And this is also very progressive work for the time, if you're talking about the 1800s, where she wrote the forest song about not over-exploiting the nature, and can we find that balance between human needs, that what we need to take from the nature, and without dominating it and living in harmony. So Lesa Ukrainka, Forest Song, and many others. This is a difficult challenge, but I'm going to just stop.
Oh, thank you. You've opened up a whole new world for us.
And thank you so much for your time. Thank you. Thank you very much, and see you around. Thank you very much.
Okay. Bye. Thanks.
Thank you.